Good morning, NSF members and participants. We welcome you to our event this morning. We are very glad to see everybody is up early and checking in. We have a very interesting and timely talk, I must admit. We always say our talks are timely. This one is particularly timely. Very glad to have our presenters from START to join us today. And with that, we will start by, we have a great panel, and we're going to start with Dr. Amy Pate introducing START. So many of you may have joined us for our presentation in July when we talked about the cartels. And we had the director, William Braniff, talking to us then, but Amy is joining us today as the Deputy Director, and she's going to give you just a little bit of background into the START Institute, and then we'll get started. So, Amy.
Thank you. And thanks everyone who has taken the time out of their morning to join us. We're very excited at START to be partnering with NSF and participating in this talk series. It's great to have all of you come and join us this morning. I'm the Executive Director and Research Director at START. So just to give you a little bit of background on who we are as an organization, we opened our doors in 2005 with funding from the Department of Homeland Security as a center of excellence. We are the 5th center of excellence to be set up by DHS, looking at all sorts of facets of terrorism and extremist threat and other areas of DHS concern. We were set up as the Behavioral and Social Science Research Center to look at the causes and consequences of terrorist activity. And so from those early days, 2005 terrorism was really, the study of terrorism was really in its infancy. And so, and really for our first decade, what we focused primarily on was building an empirical knowledge base to understand the terrorism threat. And that included a lot of data collection, and our panelists today, Liz and Sheehan, have been very involved in some of that data collection, which they'll be talking about more, in order to test hypotheses and just build the science for the study of terrorism. And we continue that work to the present. More recently, we have broadened our emphasis quite a bit to look more broadly at asymmetric threats. And so if you were able to attend the July talk about cartels, that's an example of that expansion from beyond just classical, the study of just sort of traditional terrorism and terrorists to other sort of bad actors in the international sphere, that non-state actors. And we are also expanding to asymmetric threats related to misinformation, disinformation, those types of activities. And so we're very excited about the kind of future research that we're going to be doing under this broader umbrella, and our ability to share it with you in the future, as well as those research streams develop and mature. But today we're going to be, Liz and Sheehan are going to be talking about one of our more traditional focus on terrorism, although even there we've extended to things that are what we call terrorism adjacent, with the bias data set looking at bias incidents and actors. So both Liz and Sheehan work on the domestic radicalization team, and specifically on the profiles of individual radicalization in the United States data set, as well as the bias incidents and actors study data set. And they bring to the table just a long history and depth of knowledge and expertise in this arena. Liz got her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. She's our in-house expert on all things far right, especially in the extremist sphere. And Sheehan, she is now the data collection manager for PIRES, but she brings to the table just years of expertise in looking at perpetrators of terrorist violence, having come to PIRES from another one of our longstanding data sets, the Global Terrorism Database, where she oversaw the perpetrator identification team. So I am going to, with that, hand this over to the people who really came to this talk to listen to, Liz and Sheehan. but I will be online. So if you have questions about START, I'll be willing to field those at the end as well. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate that introduction. And we're very grateful for the work that you're doing and the partnership that you have with the National Security Forum. So with that, Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Well, yes, as Maureen and Amy said, my name is Elizabeth Yates. I'm here with my colleague Sheehan Kane, and I'm going to talk to you today about domestic terrorism. Let me get my slides working here. Yes, so okay. Yes, as you can see from our title, we're going to spend most of the next hour talking about historical and contemporary trends in domestic radicalization. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the implications of these trends for understanding the current moment in extremism, as well as what we think is the importance, the really critical importance of creating reliable and consistent data in this space. Right before we do that, though, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our specific team and our approach to studying domestic extremism. So Sheehan and I are exactly 2/3 of the full-time staff on our 3-person team here on domestic radicalization. And the primary work of our team revolves around creating and maintaining a series of data sets that track domestic radicalization in the United States. So I'll just start by showing you a quick snapshot of one of the tools that you can access online to look at our data. So I know as Amy was talking about how START's mission is focused on creating empirical data that is, really sort of creates an empirical basis for the study of terrorism. One of the goals within that is also to make it publicly available and publicly accessible so that researchers and practitioners and people who are interested can take this data on their own and take a look at it. So this is our primary data set. It's called the Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States, which we call PIRUS. And yes, we have an acronym for everything because no one wants to say all that all the time. And what PIRUS is it is the only publicly available data set in the country that tracks the illegal actions, background characteristics, and radicalization pathways of extremists in the United States across time, as well as movements and ideologies. So it's not comprehensive, it's representative. That means, as far as it can be based on open source data, which it is. So we collect this all using publicly available documents such as court records. We're very good at digging through court records now. News articles, reports, public-facing social media, that kind of thing. What we do is try to test the theories that people have proposed to understand extremism and to say, okay, well, we've got quantitative data. How can we look at that, right? It is also based on our criminal definition of extremism that focuses not on people's, beliefs or ideologies, but on the criminal actions. So to be an individual that we count here, you generally have to have committed a crime in advance of the ideology that you are looking at. So again, we examine across ideologies. We're relatively agnostic as to the ideology, but we do track some differences for research purposes. So you can access this. You can also download the Excel spreadsheet and play around with it. I know that I have spent a lot of time doing that myself. So, okay. Then the other thing I want to talk about a little bit here is just some sort of general, the opportunities and challenges that we face in studying domestic extremism, and that we know that people who are interested, practitioners and policymakers, also face in this space. So we do, as I said, we track extremism across ideologies. We have done a ton of work looking at Islamist extremism. I had to stop Sheehan today from trying to share a bunch of new data we have looking at social networks of ISIS and AQ because we're both really excited about it and think it's very interesting. But we wanted to narrow the scope today just to fit into 1 hour. So we're looking specifically at the types of extremism that are generally referred to as domestic, right? But we can certainly talk about those other elements as well. So one thing that we think is really important about this is that it does allow us to empirically test theories and assumptions. So for example, as Amy was saying, in 2005, 10, 15 years ago when these theories were coming out, they were really based on small n case studies, right? Or just observations of some of the most famous terrorist attacks and things that have gotten a lot of attention that people were looking at. So for example, one sort of general observation was that terrorists and violent extremists and extremists generally tend to be young men, right? And I think no one who's paying attention here will be surprised to learn that our data shows that that's generally true, right? No one's going to be shocked by that. But we do find that there are differences in different categories of extremists in age that can help us understand how people radicalize. So for example, extremist anti-government actors tend to be a little bit older, right? Than other extremists in the far left and the other elements of the far right, as well as Islamist extremists. And probably won't be shocked to learn that violent extremists tend to be, as opposed to non-violent extremists, tend to be younger. So by building this data set, we are able to sort of, see if there's data behind those kind of assumptions and observations that sometimes seem common sense, but might be a little bit more complex. The other reason this is really important is because having done that, it helps us to allocate resources according to threats as they're emerging, as they require attention, and then it also helps us to engage with communities based on this consistent, reliable data, right? So we can say, look, we've done the research, we know where the problems are, this is what we need to be focusing on, and it really helps to potentially avoid some of the politicization of this field that is, of course, endemic to it. But there are a lot of considerations in this area as well, and we are constantly aware of them and addressing them throughout our work all the time. One, of course, is legal considerations, right? So First Amendment protections, this is America, you can say and think what you want. We are always cognizant of that. As I mentioned earlier, in our research on these projects, we consider extremism to be generally a criminal extremism. So, we don't track people who are just expressing their ideas or beliefs that some people might find repugnant. We are really looking at the criminal actions that people take in order to advance those ideologies. But that's difficult for a lot of reasons, partly because, as I'm sure most of you have some idea, domestic extremism, international terrorism, and hate crimes are all treated really differently under the law. That's at the federal level and at the state level. So there's a international foreign terrorist designated list by the State Department, and of course, if you support those groups, then you are subject to legal sanctions, whereas if you spend lots of energy and resources supporting the ideologies or groups associated with, let's say, white nationalism or environmental extremism, as long as you don't do anything illegal, you are welcome to continue to advance those ideas and, of course, sort of build those networks that might be related to criminal actions, elsewhere. And also then when people do commit criminal acts, they're treated differently sometimes, right? So for example, Islamist extremists are much more likely to they almost always get federal charges, right? So one, for researchers, that makes it a lot easier to track, right? So we have much easier access to their court documents. Journalists have easier access to their court documents. There's much more attention in media typically. And it's certainly easier to track and understand. Hate crimes are, we have a lot of data showing that they're less likely. Sometimes, of course, they're less extreme, but they're less likely to be charged at the federal level. Often those actors are less likely to be just referred to as terrorists or extremists in the media and by public authorities. So that one makes it harder to track, and then also makes it harder to then challenge some of the assumptions and observations that people draw based on the public representation of this issue. So it's kind of a cycle, whereas it's harder for us to find the data, to speak to it, and then it's also that the views get more skewed based on that reality. And of course, as I mentioned, state law, differs across states and federal code. So we have all sorts of data now about how we figure out how we can try to get court docs from different states and what different charges occur, but it's always a difficult thing to navigate. And of course, there are political considerations, right? Violent extremists often use criminal violence to advance agendas that lots of other law-abiding citizens believe in, and that's the reality, always has been across extremist ideologies. And it's something that, we all are aware of, and I think it's very sensitive, and it should be sensitive. This is something that people should be concerned about. So sometimes that's an uncomfortable reality that we have to address when we're talking about domestic extremism, especially. Of course, then there are academic considerations that are really specific to us as we're doing this research. And one is that the sort of labeling and creating these ideological categories is an incredibly fraught process. None of them are perfect. None of them are great. They change over time. They overlap with one another. The movements are constantly shifting. We do basically create, like most researchers, we create large sort of buckets of categories in order to track trends. But we always track sub-ideologies and movements as well to try to understand the nuances and the beliefs of these groups. So we'll talk about both as we go. And then again, these are, sort of working definitions always. These are never perfect. So those are some of the things that we deal with just on a daily basis when we're thinking about domestic extremism and creating this data. And we can speak to more of these, as we go, of course. So before I turn things over to Sheehan, I'm just going to show you a couple of different trends that we think are helpful in understanding contemporary domestic extremism with a broader historical picture. So the first is, this is just a breakdown of ideological categories of domestic extremism over time. So you can see here, the far left especially was prominent in the 70s. Of course, you can think about the Weather Underground. And this is over percentage, right? So this isn't actually number of attacks, but this is as a percentage of total extremists that we've looked at in Pirates. So the far right was a lot more violent here. And then, of course, you started to see Islamist extremism really jump a little bit in the mid-1990s, but then after 2000. And then you're also starting to see some far-left extremism here. This ends in 2018. But, I think most experts will say that we don't have the most updated data. This is academic data that isn't always immediately contemporaneous, but that there are, an expansion of domestic terrorist threats generally. But you can see, the Islamist extremists, I'm sorry, the graph is a little bit cut off here, but on my screen, but declined pretty recently after the fall of the caliphate, right? So there have been a number of foreign fighters, which I think I mentioned is a project we have done a lot of research on, and that declined pretty precipitously just as a moment when other sort of domestic terror threats were growing. So it's just something to keep in mind, that extremism in the United States is incredibly diverse. It shifts and changes, and yeah, it's just a complex picture. So another thing we're excited to talk about is our data looking specifically at hate crime offenders. There's really not very good data right now looking at hate crime offenders specifically for lots of reasons, but it's a very hard thing to track. And so one thing we've done is we made a representative sample as much as we can of hate crime offenders specifically in the United States. And we wanted to understand with some specificity how the victims and the specific motivations of those offenders had changed over time. So we found a few interesting things. One is that anti-Muslim, anti-Arab hate crimes had jumped, of course, after 9/11, but then had also started to increase in the last 6 or 7 years. At the same time that anti-African American hate crimes have been a pretty large percentage, a majority even most of the time, of hate crime victims in the United States, but that's waxed and waned, right? And as you can also see, anti-Semitic crimes have always been a smaller percentage, but a large, still nonetheless, percentage over time. And anti-LGBTQ have also shifted. So this, again, just sort of helps us understand shifting trends in the long term. I think, Sheehan, you're going to start to talk about some of our characteristics and background data.
Yep, great. Thanks, Liz. In the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about some of our data from the PIRUS data set. On this slide, I'm going to focus on the characteristics of US extremists. So here we have age at public exposure, which Liz discussed a little bit earlier. Basically, public exposure means that is the individual's date of arrest or the date of ideologically motivated illegal activity. So here we can see that extremists within the far right tend to be older, whereas those in the far left and Islamists tend to be about 9 years younger on average, with far right extremists averaging about 38 years old, and those on the far left and Islamists averaging about 29 years old. So for percentage female, as you can see, there is a far less percentage of female participation in ideologically motivated illegal action among far-right extremists and Islamists. So why is this the case? Likely this is due to how women are viewed within these communities and therefore tend to play more submissive roles. Within the extremist far right exists the symbolic narrative that white women must be protected. However, research shows that women within the extremist far right also play other roles, such as involvement in propaganda, recruitment, preparing meals for members of the group, and so on. None of which is considered illegal activity within the US, which therefore would not merit inclusion in our data set. For low education, far-right extremists and Islamists tend to have lower levels of education, meaning that they do not possess any college experience, with those on the far left tending to have higher levels of education. For socioeconomic status, our research shows that around 25% of all ideologies have a low socioeconomic status. For military experience, we see here that 23% of far-right extremists within our data set have military experience. While this is still a low percentage, with 77% of far-right extremists not having military experience, I would still consider 23% to be somewhat alarming, in that these individuals possess military training that may allow for them to carry out a more successful and lethal attack. For criminal history, this variable includes both violent and nonviolent criminal history. The data illustrates that far-right extremists are more likely to have a criminal history than their far-left and Islamist counterparts. Internet radicalization. So in the age of the internet may not necessarily play a central role in radicalization, but ultimately it plays some role in the majority of our cases across ideologies. For evidence of mental illness, our data shows that there is a higher rate of mental illness among far-right extremists and Islamists. And for substance abuse, there is a high rate of substance abuse among far-right extremists and Islamists. Both evidence of mental illness and substance abuse are important factors in that these individuals need to be getting the help and resources they need prior to engaging in extremist activity, which I will discuss in a bit further detail in a few slides. Okay, so here we have the duration of radicalization for extremist offenders in the United States. So basically, this slide illustrates the duration of radicalization for extremist offenders. And here we measure radicalization as the period of time between the first evidence of radicalization, whether that be in beliefs and/or behaviors, and the individual's date of arrest or date of ideologically motivated illegal activity. So here, red represents short, less than 1 year, orange represents 1 to 5 years, and yellow represents greater than 5 years. And so really the biggest takeaway that I think we're seeing here is that there are significant windows of opportunity to disrupt the radicalization process before individuals mobilize. So this tells us that nearly 50% of far-right extremists go through a radicalization process that takes over 5 years, and another 32% between 1 to 5 years. We also see very similar radicalization timelines among the far left. This is where relationships with civil society are absolutely critical and can empower employers and community leaders to recognize when someone may be engaging with the idea of violent extremism and support them in a non-criminal justice intervention. However, it is important to note here that the durations of radicalization processes are shortening in recent months. In fact, we have seen individuals radicalized in mere weeks. So for example, Jessica Prim, a QAnon sympathizer who was arrested near the US Navy hospital ship Comfort in possession of several knives after having discussed the need to take out Joe Biden, was radicalized on the internet in just a few weeks. Unfortunately, this makes these threats even more challenging. And if these processes are not disrupted, we absolutely run the risk of mobilization toward violence. Okay, so for extent of violent plots in the United States by ideology from 2000 to 2018, here the red represents nebulous plots, mostly meaning general ideas and threats in absence of planning and preparation. Orange represents failed or foiled plots, and yellow represents successful plots. So I think the biggest takeaway here is that 60% of the violent far right and 69% of the violent far left successfully carried out violent plots, intending to cause casualties. But do keep in mind that the sample size for the far right extremists is much smaller than the sample size of the far left extremists. Is much larger, sorry, than the sample size of the far left extremists. Violent Islamists, on the other hand, were only successful in 24% of violent plots. So why is this the case? Islamists are much more likely to have their plots foiled by law enforcement and can be arrested on material support charges if they are supporting a group such as Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, for example. Whereas someone who is fundraising or recruiting or joining, for example, the Boogaloo movement or the Animal Liberation Front cannot be arrested on a material support charge. Historically, the United States has allotted greater resources and personnel to international terrorism. But in the last year, we have seen more resources allotted to domestic extremism. However, as we continue to evaluate the current threat and see violent domestic extremists acting with a higher frequency of success than with international terrorism, we really need to continue to adapt and get better at terrorism prevention within that sphere as well. Okay, so here we have risk factors for violent outcomes among extremists. This graph illustrates individuals who are more likely to engage in violence and those who are not. Individuals with stable employment and in stable long-term relationships tend not to be at risk to engage in ideologically motivated violence. However, you can see here that pre-radicalization criminal behavior, which includes both violent and nonviolent criminal behavior, is the strongest predictor of a violent outcome once someone adopts an extremist worldview, making them almost 2 times more likely to be involved in a violent outcome. This is followed by individuals who are involved in an extremist network and thus have a social network with other extremist friends, making them almost 2 times more likely to be involved in a violent outcome. The next best predictor is those with a history of mental illness. While a known or suspected history of mental illness, of course, does not cause radicalization by itself, if an individual has a history of mental illness and then adopts an extremist worldview, then they are much more likely to engage in extremist violence compared to another extremist. Therefore, it is absolutely critical that community partnerships and intervention take place early.
Yeah, thanks, Shan. Yeah, so as we said before, to keep in mind, these are, these different ideological categorizations that we're talking about are broad buckets, but they do include so many actors from different movements. So, we have extremist anarchists in the far left or extremist anti-government actors in the far right. And I think, a lot of the findings that Sheehan is pointing at is showing the difference between the legal statutes and legal treatment of these groups compared to Islamist groups and how much more difficult it is to track and understand them. So that's really something that we find consistently and would like to think about more. Okay, so I now want to pivot a little bit and talk about what the implications of this data are for understanding the current context. I think we all realize that we are in a particularly contentious moment. And so I want to address what some of those dynamics are that might be particularly relevant here. So of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, this has created a captive audience for online propaganda consumption. How many people are spending more time at home, especially young people not in school or not allowed to see their friends, etc., or unemployed, are home consuming content, and extremists know that they're there and they're targeting them. Another problem is that conspiracy theories are flourishing in this moment. There's, when we think about when people are vulnerable to conspiracy theories, of course, we can think about moments when people are feeling unsettled, feeling concerned, feeling like they need explanations for these unprecedented times. And this is a moment when people are looking for that. And so we see anti-Asian, anti-Semitic, and anti-government conspiracy theories especially flourishing right now, which feed a number of different kinds of ideologies in extremism. Another issue is that the government's legitimacy is in question. Again, these are unprecedented times, and the federal government, as well as state governments and local governments, have been imposing laws and regulations that a lot of Americans have never experienced before and have questioned. So to the extent that both the left and the right draw on anti-government ideas or skepticism of the government, this makes certain people particularly vulnerable to these sort of extremist conspiracy theories and such that can draw on that. High unemployment, of course, people are just more vulnerable. And this exacerbates disparities, and for ideologies that really emphasize this inequality, this brings this to the fore, right? People working in service jobs maybe are less likely to have them, and that kind of thing. And then, of course, foreign influence operations, all the foreign actors that are trying to use this as an opportunity to advance narratives about the relative strength of their countries over the US. They are doing what individual non-state extremist actors are doing, which is trying to take advantage of people's concerns and very real grievances, and trying to adapt those views to their extremist conspiracies and narratives. And then at the same time, this is 2020, and we're in the middle of a very politically polarized and high mobilization moment. So that's just more opportunities for extremists to mobilize around these existing events and grievances. So obviously tensions in political activity are very high. There are rallies and protests and all sorts of things going on. And those are moments, while they are, maybe largely populated by regular everyday Americans, of course, those are opportunities for extremists to try to take advantage of people who have existing grievances and to mobilize them. And so, to twist the narratives to their advantage, to try to find individuals to join them, that kind of thing, to mask their ideas and to fit in and to try to mainstream it into a more sort of normal seeming ideology. These are all things that are happening right now, and that in this moment there's just more opportunities for that. And then, of course, the growth of online radicalization. In 2020, I feel like everyone's been saying for years that the growth of online radicalization is something really critical to understanding domestic extremism, and that's true. But it continues to be even more true all the time. I think about how in the last 6 months, how our lives have become even more online. Here I am talking to you right now, of course, right? And so radicalization has occurred even more online. As Sheehan mentioned, pretty sure everyone is seeing a more rapid escalation of radicalization. So if you have people at home, they're just consuming a ton of information very quickly. We've seen this in some of the very young people, white supremacists, for example, Islamists as well, who are just absorbing this content so quickly that they're radicalizing in months. And that is something that is very different from how radicalization typically occurred, through social networks, even 10 or 20 years ago. We're also seeing a lot more hybrid ideologies. I keep saying how difficult it is to categorize people and to label people. We do it for research purposes, but it's very difficult. And it's not perfect. But that's even more difficult as people are sort of radicalizing individually online. So they're not, joining official groups where they have mentors and people that guide them and people that, inculcate in them and make them read all this particular content. They're sort of jumping around from things online, and there are anti-government ideologies that spread across the left and the right. They're drawing on those. They're picking just whatever they find that seems the most violent, and so that is just a reality of the growth of online radicalization, and something to keep in mind. And then another element here is that there are more transnational connections. So, we've been using the sort of terminology that's really popular in, that's useful and common in law enforcement and in terrorism studies generally, between domestic radicalization and homegrown violent extremism, which usually refers to Islamist radicalization. But of course, the ideologies that typically fall into DT do have international, foundations and connections. A lot of the animal rights, extremism, what started in the UK, a lot of course, neo-Nazism is largely based on Nazi ideologies and organizing that occurred in Europe. So that's always existed, but we have absolutely seen it grow in recent times. Due to online radicalization, as well as some other sort of dynamics that are occurring globally. So we're not going to get into all of that, but I am just going to show you one more piece of data that sort of illustrates one element of how that's occurring. So this here is preliminary data looking at the percent of far-right terrorist attacks motivated by xenophobia, or typically what we think of as anti-immigrant attacks. So this is based on data comparing from the Global Terrorism Database, comparing terrorist attacks. So this isn't extremists, but this is specifically terrorist attacks in the United States and in Western Europe. And again, this is that broad category of far right that can include, all sorts of kinds of attacks. It's, largely a lot of white nationalists and white supremacists, but this is looking at the ones that are specifically targeting Muslim, immigrant populations. And so you can see in Western Europe that this has been, at least half or the majority of attacks for years, right? But in the United States, we've seen a recent change where the targets are sort of converging in the United States with their European counterparts. And so we see that these actors are really becoming a lot more similar in Europe and the United States. And this is something that we can also see in the growth of mass casualty attacks by white supremacist and white nationalist and xenophobic actors. So, for a long time, the plots that we saw, and I know Sheehan looked at this a little bit, the plots that we saw by white supremacists and anti-government extremists were much less likely to be mass casualty events or even typical terrorist attacks, right? They certainly occurred, but they were more likely to be sort of spontaneous hate crimes and that kind of thing, which also, of course, are much harder to disrupt. But we're seeing a convergence again between Islamist tactics and extremist tactics among white nationalists, where they are unfortunately, devastatingly killing dozens of people in terrorist attacks using firearms. So this is something, and they're referencing each other, they're speaking to each other. So even if they're lone actors that are acting independently in the United States and in Europe or elsewhere in the West, they're referencing each other in their manifestos, they're engaging with each other online. So understanding that transnationalization in the space of domestic terrorism, I think, is a really important dynamic. And that's just one element of data that we're looking at now. So I think Sheehan is going to talk a little bit more about the importance of reliable data, and then we will be available for all of your questions.
Yeah, we just wanted to take the opportunity to conclude with kind of like the ins and outs of data collection and the importance of good data collection in general. And so we at START, we're always striving for accuracy, consistency, and objectivity with all of our data sets. Our data sets are either comprehensive or representative, with representative meaning the data is an accurate depiction of what is going on according to open sources. And so good data collection takes both time and a great deal of resources. For example, on the PIRUS project, we actually lag behind in real time purposefully to allow for details on a case to come out and, if applicable, for court records to become available. And so once we begin the data collection process, there are numerous phases that we must go through, including but not limited to training team members, identifying extremists, criteria coding each extremist for inclusion in the data set, ensuring that the data set is representative, coding each extremist, and of course, a very rigorous quality control of all of the data. And so therefore, it takes both time and ample resources to produce high quality data. And unfortunately, there are a lot of bad data sets out there that you have to be aware of. And so it's important to know what to look for in good data. And so I think that today, both Liz and I have demonstrated that the violent far right is responsible for a majority of violence in recent years. And we are also seeing the internationalization of the far right. And so many organizations and government agencies are aware of this trend. And Congress actually included language last year that requires both better data collection and reporting on domestic violent extremism. And so while we are seeing more resources being pivoted toward violent domestic extremism, I do think that it is crucial now more than ever to have even more resources, specifically moving toward high quality and nonpartisan data collection on violent domestic extremism. And in order to counter the threat, we first need to clearly and objectively identify what the problem is. And that can really only be done through good data collection. And so violent domestic extremism, of course, has become both complex and multifaceted. And I think that we will gain far greater insight through objective data collection. And so with that, that concludes our presentation. And so at this time, we're happy to take any questions.
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you both. I am very grateful for that very in-depth presentation. I'm going to start the questions. Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you in a minute to give your feedback, but I think it would be really helpful if you could just clarify some definitions that you used extensively throughout the talk. So the two definitions that I'd like you to clarify is far right and far left. How do those two how do you make a differentiation between those two? And then the second one is, can you define clearly how the difference between extremism and terrorism?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that, Maureen. Those are especially difficult but important to talk about distinctions. So the terms far right and far left have been operationalized a bunch of different ways in the context of extremism and terrorism. We generally use them to refer to groups of movements. So on the far right, that typically includes white nationalists, anti-government extremists associated with the sort of patriot militia type movement, as well as actors of hate crimes. And again, these are people that identify themselves that way, right? So again, it's with both the far left and the far right, as well as Islamist extremism, it's really difficult for people to say, wait a second, you're using a word that I might use part of that to describe myself. And that is sensitive, and it should be sensitive. And it's one of the more difficult parts about studying terrorism generally. But it's important to understand that these are people who are extremists, who are mobilizing around shared grievances that are held generally. And so they locate themselves in these movements. They may be trying to recruit from elements of that. That's, you can see now in protests occurring where there are elements, people going to that, trying to mobilize there. So it really is sort of a collection of movements. And again, it's changing a lot. So on the far left, I think the largest categories are environmental extremists, animal rights, that kind of thing, and also a growing number of anarchist extremists, as well as, sort of some communist, especially historically, but probably some contemporaneously as well. So we often do research that looks at the specific groups and ideologies and movements, because that is more specific and therefore often better. But when we're looking at, a couple of thousand of cases, it is useful to differentiate there. Does that answer your question with respect to that part?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And just one more clarification on the data that you presented. You said at the beginning that you look specifically at criminal activities. So is that on a case-by-case basis for an individual?
From individuals. So the PIRUS is, we're able to sort of track these elements and characteristics of extremism over time, but it's an individual level data set. It has expanded. We didn't show that work today, but we've expanded it to look at social networks. So as I was saying, we've basically really done the Islamists so far, so we have all this other data, but it's individual level. We did show a little bit of global terrorism data level, which is focused on the events. But I do also want to speak to your other question about the difference between extremism and terrorism. Yes. That's really hard. There's certainly an overlap. We use extremism to think about people that might do nonviolent acts or, hate crimes, which certainly can be violent, often are violent, that usually have less of an obvious political message. So, you think about a typical spontaneous hate crime might be someone on the street seeing a woman in a hijab and start harassing her and shoving her or something like that, and yelling things about Muslims shouldn't be in America or something like that, right? Clearly there is a message, there's a political intent there, there's a message there to that actor in that community, but it doesn't have the same kind of premeditated, larger political message that a large-scale mosque attack would have. So, these definitions are not perfect, they're moved around a lot, but we use extremism to try to capture that broader category of people. Excellent,
thank you very much. So now I have lots of questions, but I'm first going to turn it over to Mike Matthews from DHS to give us a little perspective from the DHS world as to how these issues are being addressed, and in particular, maybe, Mike, being addressed here in Nevada.
You bet. Thanks. And awesome presentation. I think we've only scratched the surface on this type of topic, and we can easily make this an all-day seminar. With regards to Nevada, I'm trying to gather my thoughts as I think about what can be shared and what cannot at this point. But we're seeing an acceleration of the propensity for violence across both spectrums of the extreme far right and the extreme far left. And there's a lot of implications for that. And it seems that the faster they're the more likely they are to perpetuate violence, the faster it'll come, and the more widespread it will be. And I'm not referring to a complex, coordinated attack. I'm referring to pockets of it spontaneous popping up, like somebody sees that and they replicate it somewhere else. And we're seeing that with protest tactics coming out of Portland, Seattle, being replicated across the nation within the next few weeks, and similar in New York and elsewhere. We're also seeing that they are trying to, each time the ante is upped by one side, the other side needs to do the same. And so we've entered and I don't want to say a spiral, but we've entered a tit for tat scenario between both sides of the spectrum. And unless those sides are quelled and quiet on both sides, it's my personal opinion that we're going to continue to see this type of thing. What's being done in Nevada is a lot of outreach and a lot of allowances of peaceful protests, those types of supported peaceful protests. We saw we've seen a lot of peaceful protests in Nevada. We've been very lucky compared to a lot of the other areas across the nation. Just last week, the week before, there was a negligent discharge of an assault rifle or a rifle at the Carson City Capitol. Negligent discharge wasn't intended to harm anybody, but within a week they had an arrest. They moved very quickly, and there was a unified and public outrage on both sides for that type of thing. This is not where we go do that, and that type of thing is what keeps these protests and for both sides of the political spectrum in that nice medium where everything's peaceful. We can have a disagreement. We can have an open discord between them. When we prohibit that discord and we prohibit that public discussions back and forth, is when they feel the need to make their voices heard. Similar to a 2-year-old who says, no, I don't want to do that, and he doesn't get his way, they throw a tantrum. He's upped his game. The parents have to up their game, and it continues like that. And that's very similar. So if we don't allow that two-way conversation and that two-way discourse, even on a one-to-one level when we're out getting coffee with our friends, we are enabling that thing forward. So I think in the state of Nevada, it's really important that we allow the differences of opinion and have those open and honest discussions, and even heated discussions. It's okay to be passionate. It's okay to be emotional about these things. As long as we're able to respect each other, I think that's where we're going to stay safe. And that's what we've been able to do so far. I think that's why Nevada's been able to remain relatively quiet, so to speak, even though it is a hotbed for both sides of extremism.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that context. And of course, we'll be always coming back to you to give us the Nevada perspective on these topics. So let me jump to some questions that I think are key for our presenters. One of the questions is about cycles. One of our participants specifically referenced the book, The Storm Before the Calm, about American cycles, socioeconomic institutional cycles. What's your comment on that? Are the patterns of different types of extremism, do we see them in a cyclical pattern? Do they, pop up every 50, 60, 70, 80 years? Or are we just seeing sort of a change in dynamics that isn't really cyclical? So
yeah, that's a great question. And of course, from a research perspective, there's a complicated answer to that. But I do think that there are trends. They are somewhat cyclical, looking at extremism in the United States, especially sort of from the domestic side, where they're more, the ideologies and the actions and the actors the grievances are more tied to immediate domestic issues, of course, right? So one thing we see is that when there are large-scale social changes in the United States, that people, that we do see waves of contention, including violent contention. So large-scale demographic change is something that certainly our country is experiencing now, and that may contribute to it. It's happened at other moments in the 20s. When the KKK was the largest it's ever been, was in response certainly to African American rights, but also to the immigrant population. So the increasing immigrant population from Southern and Europe and from Ireland. So you do see that sometimes. You also see, you know, large scale change in politics. Those things are, I don't know that they're entirely cyclical, but they certainly are a reaction. So again, you know, this COVID-19 pandemic, the large expansion of government power in this moment is something that people react to. So there have been other moments of that kind of action also, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm a sociologist. I do see these as partly related to larger scale changes in society, but these are also individual actions. And I think, you know, we certainly can't lose sight of that. So yeah, that's a complicated answer. I mean, I hope it's a complicated question. I hope I touched on the complication of the answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Could you, I'm gonna leave to the end so that you can end on some of the other extremism work that you're doing, hopefully teeing up a new topic, because there's quite a bit of interest in the work that you're doing specifically around, you know, issues with the Taliban and AQ and various things. So I'm going to leave that to the end. So if you can put that in your parking lot and come back to in your closing comments. But let's stick to the topic at hand. Could you comment a little bit on how you're treating or dealing or tracking issues from QAnon and Antifa? Those are two big areas, two big groups that we're hearing a lot about in the news right now. I think there's a lot of confusion as to who is whom, not necessarily between the two, but often Antifa gets lumped into the same box as Black Lives Matter, and QAnon gets lumped into the same box as white supremacists. To those two groups, what are you seeing? Are you seeing patterns? Are you seeing changes? What's happening with those two groups? And how do you track them?
Yeah, so, you know, as Sheehan said earlier, our data is, you know, 2 years behind at this point because we wait for court cases to come down. We rely heavily on court documents. You know, there's always all kinds of speculation when events first occur about, you know, and again, we don't have, as Mike and others have, you know, classified data. So we have to wait for the chips to fall or whatever. So we don't have data on those kinds of things occurring generally, especially QAnon, which is so new. But again, we're tracking illegal actions. So I think there have been about 20 illegal actions associated with the QAnon, motivated by QAnon beliefs. That is a tiny, tiny percentage of people who believe in the sort of, I guess, the base QAnon belief is that there is a child sex ring being run by elites around the country, et cetera, including everyone from Tom Hanks, right? So that core belief, you know, is a maybe a much larger group, but the people who are acting on it violently, especially, is pretty small. But they've also sort of started to gather, you know, adherents and people who are affiliated, but maybe don't have the hardcore beliefs, right? They've done a very good job mobilizing around this idea of child trafficking, which of course is something that everyone's concerned about. So, you know, again, we are barely collecting data. We try to track sort of in real time just people who may at one point qualify for this kind of analysis later on, and, you know, I think there's been about 20. In terms of Antifa, I mean, that's
Liz, let me just briefly bring up something about QAnon. So I like Liz is saying, I think something really interesting with the whole QAnon phenomenon that we're seeing right now with the Save the Children that Liz brought up is it kind of seems like it's almost like an opportunity that QAnon is taking advantage of to kind of rebrand and gain more of a following. And so something that we're seeing is so like there's something being referred to as soft QAnon, where people are kind of adhering to these Save the Children beliefs and attending these rallies throughout the world. And they're ultimately able to kind of camouflage their QAnon roots and kind of recruit more people and potentially convince them of the harder QAnon beliefs, right? And so we are seeing a ton of influencers on social media and things like that that might not necessarily have QAnon written on them, but they are, if you kind of look deeper into some of these accounts, you do see some QAnon symbols and terminology. And so like Liz was saying, like, of course, yes, it is a tiny minority who would potentially mobilize and resort to violence regarding QAnon. But I do think that what is troubling here is the number of people who are being kind of radicalized into this belief system right now. So I do find that to be something that could be a little bit troubling.
Can you go into a little bit more detail on the other side, on the Antifa side?
So, I mean, I think Antifa or Antifa is a term that means very different things in different contexts. I think there has been a mobilization on the left in response, partly to the growth of some of the right. And I think, one of the dynamics that Mike mentioned is a real problem where we're seeing these different groups react to one another. Some of the violence may be spontaneous, but they may be looking for opportunities, I think, to fight with one another and call it defensive and that kind of thing. And that's a cycle that I think is occurring. But again, we track illegal behavior, violent behavior that is ideologically motivated, and that we find evidence for. So there are definitely individuals who have been arrested for violent acts at recent protests. Again, they may be using things like Black Lives Matter protests or rallies or whatever else is going on as opportunities to engage in that kind of activity, to look for their sort of perceived enemies, that kind of thing. But it's not always apparent, and this is true across all of our research, what people's actual ideas and motivations are in their affiliations, right? These are groups that are obviously often trying to obscure their association. So, we don't know if actors who get arrested at some of these protests may be there just to stir up trouble or whatever because it's an opportunity, because they're people who want to do that, or if they have a longstanding ideological affiliation or motive. So we can't, when we find especially that information, it gives us a lot more data about what that person's radicalization pathway was. But yeah, it's hard to shake out that data early, I would say. And again, I think that it's hard to define. It's not these are not organized groups necessarily. There certainly are organized elements in groups, but it's I think right now in general, we're seeing these much more dispersed networks.
So let me shift focus a little bit away from the groups themselves to your data. And I'm going to bounce this to both of you and also to Mike. So the two sides of this question, two different questions combined. One is, how do law enforcement, Homeland Security, others use your data and who's using it? And on the flip side of that, have you seen any indication that your data is actually being used by extremist groups for their own purposes? So let's do the first part of the question first. Mike, maybe you want to start with how is the data used?
You bet. So it's difficult for me to explain how the local government uses this data without having been in that role. When I was local law enforcement, I didn't have that data, or I didn't know it was there. So at the federal level, we use it to establish trends. We use it to get our talking points across. So when we go into a private sector symposium and we're talking with all the hotels and casinos in the Lake Tahoe and Reno area and critical manufacturers of unique parts that are located in Northern Nevada, and we talk to them saying that this type of protection measure or this type of security mitigation will help protect you against this thing. And this is why we're saying this. You can see this many types of cases that speak to this mitigation have been established across the United States. So clearly it's a problem. And then we can define it even down into the state. And because it's open source, I can talk about it openly and I can talk about it greatly. It's not an ongoing case. I don't have to worry about messing up a federal indictment or a federal case that's ongoing because I have access to different information. So when I go out to a public and we sit down to talk with them and talk to them about a bombing prevention class, an awareness class, or a even human trafficking to some level, when we use these types of data that is out there by researchers who are doing this, it's very easy for me to grab it. It's very easy for me to say, look, it's not DHS saying this. I'm saying you should have the security measures in place, or you should have these types of things in place, or this type of awareness. But it's not coming from my data. It's coming from University of Maryland. It's coming from these people who are impartial researchers who don't have the agenda, that type of thing. And I can say that it's not big DHS saying it. We're saying we've seen this data. We think this is what you should do to protect yourselves. So it provides a very holistic picture of of security and protection measures and those types of things. And that's one of those things that's really helping us when we get out to speak to people who don't really want the feds present. I mean, who wants DHS knocking on the door? I'm for the feds. I'm here to help. Nobody wants that. But when we come with data saying that independent researchers and these and impartial people have vetted this information and we're using it to protect you, that's where we get our biggest bang for the buck.
Excellent, thanks. Liz, Sheehan, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we can speak to that a little bit. I mean, again, we're not providing real-time evidence, to anyone, so they're not coming to us being like, what's going on. Yeah, I do think that sometimes, especially law enforcement agencies, are so focused on facing, allocating their resources and responding to myriad threats and spreading themselves thin that, one, they may not have the time or the resources to do the data collection and the training necessarily to do the data collection that, an institute at a university or a research center at a university has. So the data collection we do is so time consuming, and people like me and Shan, maybe especially Shan, are so obsessive over it that it really takes a lot of time and resources. And that's something that we can do to say, okay, does this match what you guys are seeing? And we'll have people say to us, this kind of seems like what we see. And we can say, yeah, that's consistent with what we see over time also. So that's one thing. And then, I do think that having data that's public that they can use, that they can actually speak to, is useful, because of course they can't speak to a lot of the classified information. Yeah.
So how about the flip side?
We're very appreciative of your OCD on your data.
Good, thank you. The flip side, I don't know if anyone else on this panel has comments about that. If we've seen extremists use our data. I mean, I know from just being in the field generally that there are people who have said, yeah, like your data, and I can't think of any start use of this data, but that, or something like this, but that it sort of legitimates or justifies, says, oh, look what a good job being violent we are. Or, sometimes when you're someone like, especially our team, we're really trying to understand radicalization, right? We're trying to understand how someone, any regular human, becomes a person who does something, especially a violent, horrible thing to members of society, right? And so sometimes we are trying to understand, like, oh, they came from these kinds of experiences, or they happen to be in the wrong place to get recruited by this, that kind of thing. And sometimes people might think that it seems sympathetic or something like that. And that's just a really difficult part in trying to understand this social phenomena. But no, I don't have any examples of people of extremists themselves using START data. I can't think of any.
One thing that I can think of is not specific to START, but I've definitely seen in Islamic State propaganda absolutely boasting about data of like increased Islamic State attacks, and kind of actually even like noting specific researchers who are collecting that type of data. So we've definitely seen that.
Excellent, thanks. So a follow-on question for you, and I think this comes back to the national security context. How do you, and Mike, I'm gonna throw you in the mix on this one too. How is your data linked with other agencies? So are we getting a consistent picture? What is Homeland Security's role? The center obviously was stood up by Homeland Security, focused on at least your work in this particular context on the Homeland issues. Are you in sync with, the other intelligence agencies? Are they looking at the same problems? Do they have the same definitions that you do? Is there consistency there? And then, how practically useful is your data to others who are doing this similar type of thing? So, a little bit more of the synergy so that we know we're not just getting the University of Maryland perspective, or maybe the University of Maryland and Homeland Security perspective. Do you think this data reflects what the U.S. government how they're viewing the situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's always difficult. We at START, one of our primary goals is to make our data accessible broadly. So, by making our data public, I do think that people can take our data and incorporate the variables that they're looking for, right? So if you want to really just look at terrorism or violent extremism, you can do that with our data. And sometimes we do get requests for information for people saying, okay, what is this? This is really what we're looking for. And we try to answer those as quickly and as accurately as possible. And, you know, we won't do anything our data can't do if we didn't collect a variable or because it's not reliable, whatever, we can't do it. But, you know, we will try to focus explicitly on the requests for information that people have. And that might be like, oh, you know, can you look at the growth of, you know, there may be protest violence or something like that versus terrorism. And we don't have great event level data on that, but we can talk about the kinds of arrests that might occur at a protest versus the kinds of arrests that might, you know, be some kind of sophisticated mass casualty attack. So, you know, all I can say is that we came up with these definitions and categorizations and trends based on drawing from the literature and from the way that this space is kind of defined. But yeah, we understand that people, and especially practitioners and law enforcement and other interests, have more specific, you know, kinds of needs, and we hope that our data is broad enough. And frankly, by having publicly available data sets, we're able to do that in a way that most other people aren't. So tons of people, researchers at universities, institutions, create data sets and don't make them available, and you can't do that on your own. And you know, so that is something that we put a lot of effort into to make possible.
I'll briefly comment on it that this type of data is shared widely in and amongst the federal community, and we have people at almost a local level, at the state level, that takes data like this and makes infographics for us or summaries and those types of things, so we can use that, and it is shared just prolifically within our community. It's myself and a lot of my counterparts have indicated that it's not so much a duty, or, you know, it's not so much a need to know, but it's a duty to disclose. And so we push out open sources of data like this at just in mass. And we have, let's talk about geospatial data and open source geospatial data that's tied to geography and tied to a specific spot on the map. There's communities within the federal government that upload this type of data into map sets and into data layers and into access points for everyone else to use. So I can look at cross-border incursions from DEA and pull it up and look at critical infrastructure vulnerabilities within a 1 mile distance of routine border incursions and stuff like that from drug cartels. And that's not something that I'm not going to track. That's not what my focus is. But I can use the DEA's data, and they got it from somebody else. And so there's a lot of good information sharing going along the federal government. And these types of institutions and this type of data set is instrumental to our not only war on terrorism, but our duty to protect the homeland. And these types of data in mass is what makes it effective and efficient. Is so I can reach out to my counterparts in the FBI and say, hey, I've got this piece of data. Do you have anything like it? And they'll give me what they have. And together we make a complete picture. And so, yes, there is a lot of sharing. As far as uniformity of terms and stuff, I think it depends on the topic. And I think it depends on what the focus is. The FBI is going to have a different focus than DEA. DEA is going to have a different focus than Homeland Security investigations, and et cetera. So it all depends on what their focus is and what they're trying to protect. And it's also determined by what Congress has put in statute. A lot of what we do in critical infrastructure and soft target protection is mandated by federal law. So I have to go by that definition. I have to follow that because we're obligated to do so. DEA may have a different definition of it because they have a different funding stream and a different law that they're required to adhere to based off their the way they came into be under federal law and federal statutes and whatnot. So it all depends, and a lot of it's outside of our control, unfortunately. But down on the field level, when I'm reaching out to my counterparts at the FBI or Secret Service and we exchange information, we're kind of talking the same language because we're focused on a local level. So we're looking at the same type of problem, even if it's from different avenues.
So the National Institute of Justice has funded this bias hate crimes offender study, and so yeah, we have to go through a process of uploading our data onto government websites where everyone can access it. Frankly, sometimes those sites are hard to access, so we actually try to make them more accessible than those sites because they're weird to navigate. And yeah, so we actually usually post that. In fact, we're all of our PIRS data is all posted on our website directly, and with the Keshe tool and other things, because we want to make it accessible. That's a real goal, right? But yeah, we also meet with funders and keep them updated on what kind of findings we're having as the projects evolve. We also meet as often as possible. We have an outreach team that tries to reach out to law enforcement organizations, to CVE practitioners, and to people who are working in the field to say, hey, here's what we found. And we also try to move some of this data. This is really what we talked about today, is really the basic data. It's largely even just descriptive data. It's the analysis on it isn't even that sophisticated, but we are also building projects that are more directly applicable. So our team is also involved in a project to try to create training materials for probation officers who are treating and addressing extremism, to try to understand, try to be able to identify extremists that come through their doors. So, if they have a federal charge, especially associated with like an Islamist plot, they're going to know who they are. But if they have, hate crime charges, or, just drug charges, but they're associated with other, white supremacist groups or something, they're not going to have access to them. So I'm going off here, but we do, even in addition to just sharing our data with as wide an audience as possible, we have projects that specifically speak to the populations that are using it on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we're going to close. Before we do, I just want to make a plug for our next NSF talk, which will also be timely, of course. It will be on cybersecurity and cyber threats in the United States. Carrie Nemovicher will be presenting to us. Mike, I hope you're able to join, because I would like to bring in the concept of election security on that. So in closing then, I'm going to turn it to Liz to just give us that snippet that says, tie what you talked about today to some of the other larger topics. I have a slew of questions that we did not get to, which I will pass to you to see whether you could give me some feedback, and then we can pass them back. And a lot of issues on, the philosophies, the strategies to address extremism, those kinds of things, and more specifics on the issues that you mentioned on substance abuse, mental health issues. But what I would like you to do is close and tee up how you tie what you talked about today to some of the more traditional topics that we know of, which is, terrorism and the related issues of terrorism in the major groups that we've been looking at for, well, going on way past 20 years now. So with that, I'll give you the last word, and I thank all the participants for sticking with us as we ran over a few minutes in the questions, and I look forward to seeing you. If anybody who is still on has specific questions, you are welcome to email me, and I will make sure they get passed to the presenters. So thank you, Liz and Sheehan and Amy and Mike and Aaron, for being with us, and I will give you the parting words.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you everyone for having us here today. I know there's a lot we haven't gotten to. I know there's so much more to be said. I got a PhD, which means I'm willing to talk at people for as long as they are willing to sit and listen to me. So, I'm happy that, I imagine we'll be engaging further down the road, and I look forward to that. Yeah, so my sort of concluding comments would be, one, as I touched on before, we are absolutely in a very contentious moment. We are all consuming a ton of news about what's happening. I know we're all very concerned and watching it very carefully. And so, I would say that through this kind of research, I have learned to wait. I'm not a person in law enforcement or other who has to act on these right now, but as someone who's trying to understand the world and what's happening, that we're able to take the time to wait and to see, okay, what really happened, what are good sources of information on what's happening, what is reliable, and to try to, really think carefully before making assumptions and judgments, and then to try to place that in the context of what real threats are and what is dangerous, because it's absolutely transforming, the extremist landscape. That there's no question. It's an interesting time to be an extremism researcher, I'll say that. And then in terms of thinking about domestic extremism today, in sort of using some of the frameworks that others have used, especially to study Islamist extremism. You know, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but I think one of the most worrying trends is the use of mass casualty tactics by sort of, you know, domestic extremists, especially white supremacists and white nationalists. I mean, we have graphs on this. This was something that we just didn't see. Yes, there was Timothy McVeigh and there were other actors, but the rapidity and the you know, I mean, it's just been an enormous transformation that anyone who's watching can see. So to think about, to use the kinds of ways that we think about terrorism, to put it in this domestic context, unfortunately, is very difficult, but it's also very necessary. But it's also a little bit different. So they're using, you know, maybe less sophisticated attacks, tactics. So, you know, using firearms, lone actors, a single guy going into a mosque and killing dozens of people by himself. I mean, this is something that we need to get a handle on ASAP. And because we're also seeing it, of course, with Islamists, there's this convergence of this kind of tactics, and it's looking at soft targets versus hard targets. It's very concerning and something that I hope we're all very focused on. So thank you again for having us. We're happy to engage and talk more. I'm sure we will. Yes, thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you all panelists. Everybody be safe, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you next time. This recording will be posted as soon as we can get it formatted and up on our website. So thank you all to the participants and the NSFers. We look forward to seeing you again in a couple weeks for our next presentation. Thank you.